Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kim Schmidt, Executive Editor of Farm Equipment Magazine. Welcome to our latest webinar in conjunction with the Western Equipment Dealers Association. Today we're going to be discussing engine chipping or tuning and where the industry is headed on this issue. Today's presenter is Eric Wareham, Vice President of Government Affairs for WEDA. He plays a major role in expanding and enhancing WEDA's state advocacy network by working with legislators, governors, and their staffs on legislative activities that impact WEDA and their dealer members. His public policy expertise and political experience is coupled with extensive state policy experience in both a trade association and private sector. Before we get started with the presentation, just a few housekeeping items. On your screen, there's a control panel with a Q&A icon. You can submit questions here at any time during the presentation, and time permitting, we'll look to answer as many of those questions as possible. And if for any reason your internet connection or even ours happens to fail at some point and it looks like the webinar has been interrupted, just go back to your email that you received earlier telling you how to join the webinar, and you can re-enter that way. All right, we are ready to get started. Thanks again for joining us, and take it away, Eric.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hey, thanks for joining us. I see we got a lot of participants, and so I think this is a relevant issue that needs discussing. And this is a presentation about chipping equipment, and I think that it's somewhat of an unspoken problem in the industry, something that people don't want to always discuss or talk about. It's something that kind of happens lurking in the shadows. And so I think we need to bring to light some of the issues that are involved in chipping, what it is, and then from the dealer's perspective, some of the other considerations you guys should have when you look at chipping in the dealership or your customers. So to begin with, we'll go with an overview here and what we're going to cover. As far as background goes, I think we need to have a useful definition to then get into talk about what is the unlawful activity that is derived from chipping. We're also going to look at the association initiatives. There's been a lot of work done on this, and chipping campaigns have been launched. It ties closely into the right to repair issue and some of the equipment demonstrations we've had around North America on that topic as well. And we're going to cover manufacturer agreements and policies. I'm not going to get into specifics about certain manufacturers and their policies, but just a broad overview of what those policies are, what are the prohibitions that dealers face, obviously some of the warranty issues. And then we're going to talk about enforcement, because I think that's something that's severely lacking in the conversation and misunderstood. What are the consequences of chipping equipment, not just from a market standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint? Are you opening yourself up to liability or even possible issues with the manufacturer and even tort and contract breach? So we'll get into those topics here by starting with a little background. And chipping is known by a couple names: chipping, tuning, or even ECU remapping, depending on where you are. At least in North America, the definition is found in I use the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's the Section 89-107B, that defines a defeat device as a means by any device, system, or element of design which senses operation outside normal emission test conditions and reduces emission control effectiveness. So what we're really talking about is installing something that modifies the piece of equipment so that it's no longer in compliance with emissions standards. And of course, as all of you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. This is an outgrowth of the different tiers that we've gone through to reduce emissions, and now tier 4. And many of you know that the engines now burn cleaner, put out air that's cleaner than the air they intake. There's a price for that, though, and that's lack of horsepower and other considerations. And so sometimes we have folks who want to circumvent those technology measures that reduce emissions, and that thereby increasing their horsepower. So they install defeat devices. The interesting thing about this is that not only for the U.S. but also Canada, and that's what CEPA is, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That's the equivalent of the U.S. EPA. What's interesting is they incorporate by reference the U.S. federal code. So they have the same definition of defeat device, which makes it useful when we're talking about compliance and then issues that we have about cross-border importation, manufacturing, and the like. I'll just jump right into what is unlawful activity, because I think this is an area where dealers may not know what qualifies as illegal. And it's very clear in statute. The Code of Federal Regulations, Section 89, 107A, states very clearly, an engine may not be equipped with a defeat device. Plain and simple. However, we have a lot of different ways to parse that language. And there's a lot of different examples and circumstances that come up. And so, for instance, the fact that it may not be equipped with a defeat device, does that prevent the dealer from doing that? Does that prevent a customer from doing that? A lot of questions come up. So I've added some other statutes here as reference to clarify those questions, beginning with the Code of Federal Regulations at 40 there, Section 89, which prohibits the removal or rendering inoperative a defeat device. And so it's not necessarily just installing a piece of equipment on that machine, it's also removing a piece of equipment that would render a defeat device inoperative. For that matter, also, 40 CFR goes into not just the people who install the defeat devices or modify equipment, it also prohibits the manufacturer selling or offering to sell and installing a defeat device. And so for those folks out there who say, well, I see this on the market, people are selling it maybe even at a farm show or a trade show, let me assure you, it is illegal and unlawful to manufacture or sell or offer to sell that device. And that's found in those are Clean Air Act violations. And we'll talk about where the teeth are in that a little later and towards the end of the presentation. Another interesting point about this is that the activity is unlawful for not only in the Clean Air Act, but also by copyright law. And so to go back here, take you back, beginning in 1996, the United States and other countries, including Canada, entered into the World Intellectual Property Organization. And as part of that, and I won't get too wonky here with you, but as part of that, we had to, as countries, develop our own protections for intellectual property. And so what developed in 96, what was adopted and enacted by Congress, was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, which prohibits the circumventing of technology protection measures or trafficking in devices that circumvent technology protection measures. So how does that relate to chipping? Well, all of those defeat devices are protected, are basically run by software and protected by technology protection measures. So a lot of the defeat devices can also be considered a device that circumvents a TPM, technology protection measure, and therefore violates copyright law. So when we see some of these devices that may come from Eastern Europe or software that comes from Eastern Europe or other parts around the world that don't have or haven't signed on to the World Intellectual Property Organization Treaty, they don't have protections for intellectual property. China is another actor here that may be manufacturing and trafficking in these things. These are copyright law violations as well. And mostly we don't talk about those because copyright law doesn't carry with it, in some instances it does, fines or injunctions, but really it's enforced by the people who own the copyrighted intellectual property. So it's up to them to enforce their rights and try to sue people and use litigation as a means to prevent folks from trafficking in defeat devices. So what are we doing about it? Well, there's been a lot of activity at the association level, and I'll share with you, and I want to share with you today the WEDA chipping campaign. And what that is, we saw this problem early on, and we heard it from our dealers and our members that there was an issue, that this was happening, and that was affecting dealerships. through a lot of different means, creating unfair trade practices. And so we needed to kind of put out some information to combat what the prevailing wisdom, I guess, was on the topic, or lack thereof, I should say. And so we created materials directed at dealers and customers to raise awareness of consequences and costs associated with chipping equipment. We made that available on our website, so afterwards, if you'd like, you can always visit there, go to our chipping campaign materials. We also included a social media campaigns that we launched in 2018 that we're continuing. And I think the general idea here is that we wanted to show there's issues with emissions. That's somewhat obvious. The less obvious, I think, is that people don't understand the amount of accelerated engine wear and decreased trade-in value on their equipment. And what does that ultimately mean? That the customer who's chipping that equipment or buying chipped equipment, that farmer eventually pays for it in the end. And so my marketing person's going to kill me when she sees this. I distorted our beautiful image to include it on the PowerPoint. But the idea here is pretty simple. Who pays the bill for chipped equipment? And the answer is the farmer pays. How do they pay for it? By accelerated wear, voided warranty issues, and reduced trade-in value. And so these are materials that are available that you can post in your dealership if you'd like. And they're available also to customers if you'd like. We also tried to look at breaking it down for a dealer and for the customer. The three main questions here: before you agree to have farm equipment chipped, you should be asking these three questions. One, does it affect my equipment's warranty? And the answer there is we'll get into later. If it's under warranty, the answer is always going to be yes. Two, does this affect the service I can get from my dealership? Now, this is left up to the individual dealer, but what we've resoundingly heard from our dealers and dealers around the country is that, yes, it will affect it. And there's reasons why that we'll talk about later that deal with safety and liability. But it should, from the dealer standpoint, if a customer chips equipment, affect the service they get from the dealership, because it compromises that service they can get from the dealership. And three, how will this affect my engine and other parts? And that's the big driver here, that we're starting to hear anecdotal evidence. And obviously I won't share for confidential reasons what that is, but we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from dealers around North America about the consequences of chipping equipment, whether that is complete breakdowns, issues with telematics, precision agriculture, and the like, whether people are going into the software and modifying that modifies other components as well, along with the emissions controls. And we'll get into some of those a little bit when it talks about from the standpoint of liability. We've also developed some chipping campaign posters that you can post in your dealership that have some visuals here. And I think that these are wonderful examples of what we can do to raise awareness of the issue. It sort of includes and incorporates what we just talked about, the three questions. Well, this one is what the farmer pays, loss of service, violation of emissions laws, loss of warranty, and accelerated engine wear. And we discussed a little bit about what it is, because I think we need to be open and honest and have a dialogue and a conversation about this instead of sweeping it under the rug, because really that's when problems start to fester. We also have another campaign poster here. This is the reiteration of the three questions, and again, reiterating what we've talked about. And once again, this is available on our website for download. You can grab it, throw it up in the dealership. A lot of dealers say that it goes great above a urinal, not to be crass, but that's where your customers go and where they need something to look at. So this is, I think, somewhat introspective to put up there. So a suggestion. We also have a lot of other association activity involving the right to repair. And the right to repair equipment demonstrations that we've been putting on go hand in hand with the chipping issue. And what do I mean by that? What are these equipment demonstrations? Unless you've had one at your dealership, you're probably not aware of them entirely and what's been happening. but they are dealer-hosted equipment demonstrations about the right to repair. And we discuss the right to repair and how we support the right to repair, not to modify. And the modification is really where we get into the chipping, because a lot of the people that are proponents of right to repair are looking for ways that they can chip equipment, looking for ways that they can circumvent technology protection measures to boost horsepower and to change that equipment. And the problem for the dealers is that they are a lot of times doing it under the radar and can restore those pieces of equipment back to factory settings before trade-in, and it's hard to detect. And you're maybe unaware that you're going to get a lesser valued piece of equipment that you may turn around and try to sell to a subsequent customer that's going to come back on you for that decreased value in that equipment when it possibly implodes. The other thing that we're sharing at these equipment demonstrations is the industry commitment from the original equipment manufacturers. Most of them are not aware of this as well, but when we talk about why people want to chip equipment, sometimes it comes from the idea that they don't have the ability to work on their own equipment or have the availability of certain things available to them from the dealership or from the manufacturers. And so we've taken this argument out by, or this part of the argument out, by committing to end users, to customers, producers, that we will make certain things available, including manuals, product guides, product service demonstrations, training, seminars, or clinics. One of the big ones here is the onboard diagnostics via diagnostics port or wireless interface. So not only remote diagnostics, but also in-field kind of read-only diagnostic tools that provide plain language about codes. And that's where the electronic field diagnostic service tools come up. And we'll also have manufacturers have committed to providing training for those as well. And then other publications with information on service parts and operations. And that industry commitment, by the way, becomes is binding on manufacturers by 2021. And a lot of the information available, for instance, on those diagnostic tools goes back, obviously, several years. I know in the case of Deere, I think it's 1992 that they will provide all of the information on. They'll be retroactive to 1992. And then one of the concerns that we have, obviously, from modification from the dealership level is safety. Safety is a huge component. We talk a lot about in these demonstrations how modification can affect the safety of the technician that's working on that equipment that may not know or be aware of the modifications that have been made, and therefore they go into it somewhat blind, and there's some serious issues there. Obviously, the environment is one. If you're chipping to get around emissions control systems, then the environment is a huge concern. And we discuss data privacy, because anytime you start to get into modification, you start to chip things, you start to circumvent technology protection measures, you're opening up data privacy. You're opening up, the customer is opening up their technology protection measures to basically anyone if they don't really know what they're doing. And so at the same time as that, we have a lot of legislation out there, and this is a bit of a digression, but we have a lot of legislation right now in the U.S. about placing a burden on businesses to protect their consumers' data. And dealers certainly fall into that category of having a lot of data that they are entrusted with from their customers. And so they, so with that combined, creating that liability for that data, if we're forced at the same time to open up all of the technology protection measures and open up the software to folks to tinker with, then it's sort of a double-edged sword, or a catch-22. We're stuck in the middle there. So we've held 16 of these demonstrations in the U.S. and Canada, and we've had a couple more planned. We have another one coming up in Idaho here at the beginning of November. And we usually have these with industry stakeholders. And by that, I mean, generally speaking, in the U.S., it's been Farm Bureau and Farm Bureau members and their staff, to try to educate them on what's available. And then in Canada, it's the counterparts. So we've held one in Ontario and we've held one in Saskatchewan, and we've invited the industry stakeholders, the commodity groups and the like, to attend those events. And really it's an opportunity to educate those producers about what's available, and then really to start a dialogue where we can partner with them on other issues that help them increase uptime other than chipping equipment. So I want to jump into manufacturer agreements and policies. And this is where the rubber meets the road for dealers who are dealing or are addressing the issue of chipping equipment. And so while I said I wasn't going to call out any individual dealers about, or manufacturers rather, about their specific policies, what I do want to draw attention to are sort of the general policies that are included, the duties that dealers have that we see in nearly every contract, stated maybe in different ways, and what those mean. And so one of the first ones is a duty to report failures or malfunctions of products. And this is one that is maybe at first blush doesn't seem like that big of an issue, but when we start talking about dealers reporting to the manufacturers problems that arise from their customers shipping equipment, it can put dealers in a sticky spot real quick. And so that's a major issue, because in most contracts, there's a duty to report that to the manufacturer. And so that's something that we won't go into further about, what to do. There's not a policy recommendation there, but it's certainly something you should be thinking about as a dealer. How do you address that? The second is a duty not to modify. Almost every contract has a duty not to modify equipment in a certain way. And I know there are folks out there who do have to modify equipment in all kinds of ways. You're thinking, well, what does that mean? Because if you're out in grassy country, you're going to put 40 hours into modifying a combine so that it can be useful for combining grass seed versus corn or soybeans, for instance. But here what we're talking about is modifying equipment outside of the specifications that are allowed by the manufacturer. Third up is the prohibited installation of non-standard equipment. And that's maybe another way of saying the duty not to modify. And here it's basically, if it's equipment that's not provided by the manufacturer or an approved vendor of the manufacturer, then it falls outside the scope of what is standard equipment. And there is a prohibition in some contracts to not install that type of equipment. Now, certainly a defeat device would be included on that. And then fourth is prohibited modification of equipment, which duty not to modify, somewhat coterminous ideas. And again, goes back to what a dealer can do to equipment and cannot do. And then finally, what is the compliance with the law? Nearly every contract has a requirement that a dealer must comply with the law. And compliance with laws and regulations, some contracts state it as a best effort to comply with the law, that a dealer must make their best effort to comply with the law. And in this instance, when there's clear and concise law on the subject, there's not a lot of gray area. If you install a defeat device, you're violating the Clean Air Act. In a lot of contracts, that becomes grounds for termination. And that's really where the rubber meets the road, when a dealer decides or makes a decision to do something that would jeopardize their dealership and possibly be good cause for grounds for termination. And so when that customer comes to you and asks, for equipment to be chipped or to look the other way, to work on chipped equipment, is it worth it to jeopardize your agreement with your manufacturer? And then finally, this one's somewhat obvious, and I don't know if it needs much explaining, but voided warranty on modified equipment. When equipment under warranty is modified in such a way that it is now outside the standard specifications of the manufacturer or violates any of the agreements and policies, then the warranty is voided. And I think that can put a dealer in a sticky spot as well if technicians in the shop are not conveying back to the rest of the dealership what's going on. The dealership has the risk of possibly getting denied warranty claims on that equipment. And so there's a financial risk there that can be mitigated with good policies in place to prevent modification and to make it clear to your employees that modification and chipping equipment is something that's just it is a bright line that is not allowed. And so what are the teeth? Why is it that we don't want to chip equipment? And I think this is something that is really unclear to a lot of people. And so I wanted to offer some examples here and also to discuss it. So the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S., has clear fines laid out for each offense, or consider an offense as the installation of a defeat device. And so it's not, if you were to somehow have a run-in with the APA, which I hope none of you do, but if you were, they wouldn't look at it and say, okay, you've been chipping equipment, here's the fines for overall chipping equipment, you're violating the Clean Air Act and such. They're going to look at each offense of installing a defeat device. And this not only is for the dealer, this is for the customers, this is for the manufacturers of those equipment. And I included the example of a manufacturer, and I didn't put their name up, but it was a company that was manufacturing chipping software systems, and they were initially fined $300,000. That alone in itself is not good. But the real teeth came when the EPA also said that they will pay over $6 million to ensure future compliance with the Clean Air Act. And so that's something that for a small company manufacturing some software, they may not be able to survive that type of crackdown. And the crackdown is coming. The EPA, the US EPA, has stated their intent that they are going to crack down defeat devices in 2020. This is going to become a focus for them, and not just in trucking and vehicles, but also for off-road, non-road equipment, specifically farm equipment. And we have had it related to us and intimated to us that this is going to be a focus of the US EPA going forward. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration right now, this is still the direction that they are choosing to go that has been stated to us just recently. Now, beyond fines, there's also the issue of liability for a dealer. Dealers chipping equipment face contract and tort liability. And they face that liability even when customers chip equipment, not the dealer. And so as an example of that, in Ohio and Oregon, there was litigation where the customer was the one, after purchasing the equipment from the dealer, they modified their equipment, installed defeat devices to circumvent the emissions control systems, and they were subsequently injured. In the case of Oregon, the tractor actually caught on fire, and the person was burned severely. And so what do you do? When people are hurt and attorneys like myself start suing people, they look around for the deep pockets. And the deep pockets here are the manufacturer and the dealer. And so in both instances, in Ohio and Oregon, the manufacturer and the dealer were sued for damages. And so looking at it from that perspective, that not only is there an open and obvious liability issue when the dealership installs a defeat device, there's also even a indirect liability if you just sell a piece of equipment and your customer installs that defeat device. So, as an industry as a whole, and here particularly, if you lack a policy about that and you're looking the other way, then when those safety issues come up and they turn into an injured employee or an injured customer, that is going to expose you to a tremendous amount of liability. Something that really on balance does not seem worth it. And so it's important for dealers to have a very strict policy of a no tolerance for chipping equipment for installing defeat devices. It's important for the industry as a whole, because when one person does it to try to gain an unfair competitive advantage, it discredits the entire industry. And so this is something that we're seeing, where we have dealers who are playing by the rules, and maybe some who are not, or some who are unaware that it's even occurring in their dealership. And I know through conversations, again, anecdotally and not sharing specific dealers, but we've had instances where we've talked to dealers and said, hey, is this a concern for you? And they said, I don't know, I've never really heard of that issue, but I'll go check. I'll go to the dealership and check. And lo and behold, after inquiring about it with their staff and their employees, they've come back and said, yes, in fact, this is an issue. And so for those of you tuning in, maybe you are aware of it. Maybe you have a policy in place, maybe you don't. But I think it's important that you inquire about this topic within your dealership to try to mitigate the risk, not only of the jeopardizing your relationship with the manufacturer, but also the tort liability and contractual liability that you have with your customers. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up here, and I think that with this topic, there's going to be a lot of questions, and so I am willing to entertain some Q&A here if folks have any questions as follow-up to this. Kim, I know that you mentioned you had one at the outset as well.
Yes, I'm going to try to find that one again. But in the meantime, while I look for that, with the example you gave of the customers in Ohio and Oregon, I think was the other state you said, where it was the customers themselves that did the modifying, what can dealers do to protect themselves in that case where, they're the ones who ended up sued and weren't actually involved?
Yeah, it sounds like really twisted lawyer logic to try to say that the customer did this to themselves. It's kind of the robber falling through the roof while trying to break into a house and sues the homeowner type of thing. What they can do is, and that's what we have provided our chipping campaign material, is to try to educate their customers and make their policy known to their customers. I think in both those instances, there wasn't a clear policy from the dealership, and there needs to be. So that's how a dealer can protect themselves. Put up some posters and talk about it. Have a policy or a disclaimer about chipping equipment. And that is something that would go a long ways in hopefully what we see is some early verdicts that set precedents that is what protects a dealer in this instance.
And then we just got another question in that asked what the situation is for Canadian equipment. So I don't know if that means what the potential repercussions are.
So SEPA provides for violations, injunctions, and even possible shutdown orders in the case of SEPA violations. And so it's very broad language. I think in the U.S., where we're inclined to create bright line standards for violations and what those fines are. In Canada, they're usually a little more gray. There's more discretionary power within the agency or the ministry to develop those fines, but they are there for certain.
Okay, and then this was a follow-up, or I don't know if it's an additional question or a clarification question on that one, but does the dealer have to report to the manufacturer chipped equipment being brought into their dealership? Yes.
So that's in some contracts. When I go back to the slide, when we talk about a duty to report, malfunction, and I'll go back here actually to that. So a duty to report failures or malfunctions of products. And that's where I mentioned that really puts the dealer in a sticky spot. What is your obligation there? And I think that it's somewhat unclear. And I think that I think that the associations can play a role in trying to clarify what that is with manufacturers through our relationships on manufacturer relations and the task forces that we have, that this is an issue that needs to be raised. And I think we are in discussions about that, and those are ongoing, about how that difficult situation that a duty to report equipment puts a dealer in.
Okay. And then you mentioned EPA will focus on this in 2020. Any idea if SEPA will be enforcing as well?
You know, SEPA, I think that's a different issue. We're having conversations with them. Obviously, there's a new government being formed right now after the elections, and so what I can say is that in Canada at the federal level, the policy is set at the federal level, but it's left to the provinces to provide enforcement. And so we're also having discussions with ministers of agriculture and environment at the provincial level to discuss what those look like as well.
Okay. And then if a dealer is servicing a piece of equipment and discover it's been chipped, should they proceed?
If they discover it, I
Yeah.
think that they need to address it. They need to address it with their customers, but they need to have a policy in place and discuss within their dealership how they're going to do that, because alienating a customer can be a big deal. Not accepting a very large role from a customer whom you may know or not know has had that equipment chipped, and you run the risk of potentially losing that customer for good. That's a really big deal. And so I don't have an answer for that on what a dealership should do. I can tell you that as a matter of liability, legal liability, and mitigating that risk, that they need to have a policy in place that's clearly communicated to their staff, salespeople, down to the technician, to the shop level, about what their policy is.
Okay. And then I did bring up that question that we got ahead of the webinar. It is talking about how at certain altitudes it can have a significant factor in the operation of a diesel engine. So in this instance, the dealer's at 4,800 feet, and a diesel engine tuned to run at sea level loses at least 10% at that altitude. Is there any difference in instances like that where it is really about getting it to run where it should be, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's certainly on the manufacturer to have the to allow modification so that the equipment can operate at that level. They obviously can't allow violations of Clean Air Act requirements, but those are modifications that would, in the terms of the contract language, would be standard modifications. And so I think the issue becomes when it's non-standard modifications of equipment, that starts to trigger manufacturers' concern and their ability to take recourse.
Okay. And then why are the enforcement agencies, so EPA, SEPA, not going directly after the people selling the chip and modification kits, and rather seem to be going after the manufacturer, the OEM, and the dealer?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that's two-part. One is that a lot of that equipment comes from overseas, and so it's bought from Ukraine or China, and so the U.S. EPA has very little recourse in those areas to go after them. The second is that a lot of the violations, like I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, fall under copyright law, and so when there's manufacturers that possess that intellectual property, it's up to them to enforce their property rights. And so the EPA is less inclined to do that for them when the cost benefit's just too great or too disproportionate. And so I think a lot of times leave it up to, under that copyright software protection, to enforce those rights through litigation.
All right, and then this next question has a few parts to it, so bear with me.
Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges going into 2020 for chipping and right to repair, especially as it relates to policy and 2020 campaign coverage by some candidates about this? Do you think it's primarily about trying to focus communications to the end users?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are two candidates in the Democratic field, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, who have adopted right to repair as part of their national policy platform. And I think it's an issue in 2020 because Iowa is the first caucus in the nation. And when you have some Northeast Democrats going to the middle, going to the heartland country, they need something to talk about and to relate to. That's specific more than just general issues. And so I think they've picked up on right to repair as part of a progressive populist movement, and it fits with their messaging. The fact that chipping and violation of emissions control systems is really what right to repair boils down to, I think is what the key to educating those campaigns and folks who would otherwise kind of be inclined to this idea of right to repair, that this is the key to dissuading them from it, because they are very concerned about environmental issues. And if you can explain to them the connection between opening up all of this finely tuned equipment, and that the major reason for it is to modify it so that they can violate emissions control systems to increase horsepower, then I think you get those candidates to step away from that policy when they really start to understand that also we have, as an industry, committed to providing all of the things that are otherwise asked for outside of defeat devices and outside of embedded code and outside of technology protection measures. So basically, we're not allowing people to hack tractors and combines and reverse engineer that software. Excuse me. So that is going to be a big challenge in 2020, to educate those campaigns and get in front of them and raise that issue. I think also 2020 is a year in which right to repair at the state level is going to hopefully decline, because we've gone through an evolution of it being an emerging issue to something that people start to wrestle with and understand. It's introduced a couple years in a row. And then now this year, or in 2019, we saw a lot of states that previously entertained right to repair legislation that no longer introduce that yet again in 2019. So what that means to me is no legislation has passed anywhere. It hasn't even passed the committee level. But what it means is that people have looked at this issue, legislators looked at this issue and said, oh, wow, okay, we thought at first blush this was pretty simple and straightforward. As we unpack it, peel back the layers of the onion, it becomes very complex, and there are a lot of pitfalls and unintended consequences with this. Yeah, this is a bad idea. So let's leave that alone. And in conjunction with that, we've held dealer demonstrations in a lot of states. Some of them we've invited legislators to as well, so they become educated on the topic and realize what this is really getting at. So they step away from it too. So we've somewhat killed it off, and so I think 2020 will be the year in which we see whether that trend continues, where states that have introduced it in the past decide not to reintroduce legislation again going forward, and that the issue has kind of become obsolete on itself.
Here in the U.S., like you just said, a number of states have introduced this legislation, and it hasn't ended up going anywhere. Has there been similar activity in Canada with provincial legislation?
There was one bill in Ontario that was introduced in 2019 by a provincial member, and that bill, it was very broad, but the talking points of the sponsor of that bill made us to believe that he was really focused on consumer electronics, smartphones in particular. So we held a dealer demonstration in Ontario outside of Guelph, and so we invited the Ministry of Agriculture to attend that event, and a lot of producers from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, for instance, participated. And so I think we've gotten that message out there that yes, farm equipment is very different and distinct from consumer handheld electronics, that there's a lot more to it, that we're talking about real issues. Okay.
And then this next question relates to something on one of your first slide. And it says, can you please explain the 40 CFR and 89 1003A3I, where it says prohibits removal or rendering inoperative a defeat device. And does that mean if you find it, report it and don't touch it?
No, it does not. Prohibits removal, meaning if there's a physical defeat device or a piece of software that is a no, that's a misconstruing that statute. It's more about if there is a something that is, and that might be poorly worded. I might have worded that incorrectly in trying to summarize that statute. It's removing something, a piece of software or physical device that makes sure that piece of equipment complies with emissions controls.
Okay. We probably have time for another one or two questions if anyone had anything else. Oh, we've got another one. If the government keeps requiring manufacturers to fit the equipment with technology that's not reliable and hinders productivity and cost of equipment, how does the end user, dealers and manufacturers fight back?
I'm not sure I entirely understand or agree with the premise of the question, because I guess you would have to accept that the technology being put into equipment is consistently breaking down or not working. So I somewhat reject that premise of the question. But I would say that it's a continual conversation. Agriculture and farm equipment is going through a transition period right now, like many other sectors that have gone through a transition in technology. Agriculture obviously lags behind traditionally in the adoption of technology, but as we put that into the field, yes, there's going to be some issues with it, but I think we work those out, and that's a marketplace initiative, and that we shouldn't have allowances for people to modify equipment or chip equipment just because of that.
Okay. And then is reporting a chip an issue even when the unit's well out of factory and emissions warranty?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for the reasons of liability and then contractual duties to the manufacturer. When it's out of warranty, that simply means that it's not going to be covered by the manufacturer for any complications or consequences that arise from that chipping. However, you still have a lot of contractual duties under dealer agreements and then liabilities under common law that you should be concerned about doing that.
Okay. And then if a dealer took a trade for a piece of equipment that ended up being chipped, is it legal for them to resell it?
No, it is not. And that would be fall under the prohibition of selling or offering to sell a piece of equipment that has been installed with a defeat device. And so you run that risk as well. Quite frankly, as I talked about those examples in Oregon and Ohio, where a dealer was sued even though they didn't even install the piece of equipment, their customer did after they bought it. Imagine the liability you're subjecting yourself to if you know or should have known that that equipment was installed with a defeat device and you resold it to a customer. Any issues that they have arising out of that is going to be directly tied back to the dealership.
Okay. And then what are any parallels or differences with what is happening in the automotive industry?
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels, especially from right to repair, and then the related chipping criteria. I don't think that it's as I don't want to say it's not as much of an issue, and I'm not as familiar with what the methods of enforcement are in the auto dealer industry. But that's more of a consumer product. And here we're talking about more sophisticated entities on each side of a transaction, being the dealer and the producer. And it's more of a business to business transaction with a very large, expensive piece of equipment. And so that in itself raises the stakes of what we're talking about. And I think that changes the conversation a little bit and distinguishes it from the auto dealer. But they're still very similar in the sense that we're dealing with internal combustion engines and emissions criteria and whether people are trying to circumvent those.
Okay, and then I think this question relates back to the one about getting a trade that had been chipped. So if it's removed and brought back to standard, then can the equipment be resold?
It can be resold, but I would strongly suggest that the dealer make any and all make it known to the subsequent customer that equipment was chipped at some point. If you don't, then you really run the risk of liability, and I would disclaim that and provide that knowledge to the subsequent customer.
Okay, I think that about does it then for all of our questions. Today's presentation and the audio will be available on the Farm Equipment website in case anyone wants to go back and review it. Also, keep an eye on your email and the Farm Equipment newsletter for more information on the replay. On behalf of Eric, WEDA, and the Farm Equipment staff, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. When you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a short survey. Please take the survey and feel free to reach out to us to let us know what you thought of the live event and if there's any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, Kim.